All right, we just hit 2 minutes past the hour, so I think we'll go ahead and get started with today's live training session. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on this first day of May. Can you believe that? That is nuts how fast this year is going, and I think that puts us, what, about 34 days away from Inspire in Anaheim. On that note, I'll go ahead and share with you just a reminder to, if you haven't already, go ahead and register for Inspire. That'll be June 4th to the 7th out in Anaheim, so Orange County, California, where we'll have 4 days of training and technical track talks and customer-led sessions and solution center assistance, some great keynote speeches. So if you haven't been here yet to this site to check it out, see what's going to be happening, the agenda, some of those training sessions that you may want to register for, this is the site that you want to visit. That puts us 33 days out. Oh my goodness. Hopefully we will see you there. As an introduction, my name is Christine Bonthius. I'm an instructional designer here at Alteryx. Some of you may recognize me from around the community, whether that's posting a weekly challenge or publishing some interactive lessons or leading live trainings like this one. That's typically where you'll find me, and that's the kind of the realm and all things learning where I'm involved here at Alteryx. So let's go ahead and get started with today's session. But before we do, I do want to check off a few housekeeping items before we get too far in, is that all of your participants today, so everyone who called in and registered for this session, you were muted upon entry into this WebEx. We'd like to keep it that way, but if you do have any questions or anything you want to share with the class during today's session, you can use the Q&A feature that's part of WebEx. If you go to the top, there should be options for chat or Q&A. Go ahead and use Q&A so we can see your questions. I'll keep an eye on that chat list just to see if there's any questions that are coming in that I can answer while we go over today's content and workflow that we're working on. I want to remind you that today's session is being recorded. What that means is that after this session airs, so after we've finished this call today, we'll go ahead and render this video, and we'll provide the video for you on Community. So that same link where you registered to attend today's session, we'll post that recording right back there, and we'll also provide the workflows that we're using for today's session. So you'll have all the materials after we're finished today. And I also want to remind you that we are here for, let's see, we're here for about an hour, 45 minutes. We've got a lot of stuff to cover today. That's content, just some review, and building a workflow. So today's session is all about analytic app development or analytic application development for a more intermediate user. But today's session is really geared for those of you who are just starting to get interested in apps or just starting to think about what it might take to convert maybe an existing workflow that you have into a type of analytical application. Or you may be here just to kind of refresh and revisit the basics. And whether any of those are the case, you are in the right place. So let's go ahead and jump in. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about some upcoming trainings that we have on the calendar, just to remind you in case you want to join us on, next Tuesday and a few more Tuesdays until Inspire. We're going to dive into a little bit of content regarding the workflow that we're going to be building, present a use case about why we might want to build an application in the first place, some of the ins and outs about what it takes to work with what we call the interface tool palette, which are the icons that are in black on your tool palette in Designer. Then we're going to go ahead and open up a workflow. We'll build a pretty simple workflow, but we'll convert an existing flow into an analytic application. And then we'll talk a little bit about the end about where you can go to get some more support, some more help resources with regards to how to continue with some of your Alteryx development and your skill building. First up I want to bring you to before we dive in is the community. I assume that you probably have already been there considering you registered and signed in for today's training, but in case you haven't, I encourage you to check it out. The community, so community@alteryx.com, is our hub for all of our users who want to share their knowledge, ask their questions, post their knowledge, share some of their product ideas, and of course engage with all things learning and training about how to build up their Alteryx skill set, and of course interact with users just like yourselves. And if you haven't been to the community yet, you haven't earned a couple of badges, you haven't clicked on some of these helpful knowledge-based article links, I highly encourage you to do so. Registration is free and gives you access to all sorts of really powerful resources that you can use along your Alteryx journey. We host upcoming trainings, or we host live trainings just like this one that you're here today, pretty much every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific for about an hour or so. Today's training, of course, is Analytic App Development for more intermediate users, and we have a few more coming up in the month of May. Next week being a pretty special one. We've never done this before. It's Alteryx Core Certification Preparation Session. So if you're looking to try your hand at the certification exam, whether that's this month or in the future, or maybe even at Inspire itself, this might be a good session for you to attend to learn about what types of questions you might run into on this type of exam, some strategies for answering those types of questions, and to get a good sense of the tools and the span of questions that you might see on such an exam. May 15th, so in a couple of weeks, we have sessions on advanced spatial analytics, which is a good complement to some of those interactive lessons that are now available for you on Academy as well. We just posted a whole course on spatial analytics, and so this advanced course is going to touch on some of those topics and a little bit more. And then on the 22nd, we have a session that's geared more for beginners, understanding data types and just understanding what it means to work with numeric versus categorical or string values or Booleans or even spatial objects themselves. Then out through June, again, we have a whole week, well, 2 big days of training that will be happening at Inspire, so that's June 4th through 7th. And we'll pick up again with our live trainings in June. The 12th we have scheduled for Alteryx Essentials, so again, a real basic kind of introductory course. And then we'll see what else we come up with for the rest of the month. We have yet to decide, so keep an eye on your calendar to see what we're going to offer coming up. I highly encourage you to check out the Alteryx Academy. So live trainings just like this one are going to be posted on our Academy, where we host all things learning, all things training. If you're ready to try your hand at some other learning type of approaches, we have those interactive lessons that I said that kind of give you the opportunity to engage with Designer and some of those concepts without even having to open Designer at all itself. We have live trainings just like this one, so kind of lunch and learn type style that we repost on the community, so you can come back and revisit it as you'd like, as well as tons of other topics. And then we also have our weekly challenges. So that's where we give you a workflow, start and an end goal. And we have you, just like you and other users, try and put together those missing pieces in the middle to come up with a solution. And what's really neat is that so many users come up with so many different ways to do the same thing. So you always learn something new, a new tip or trick from someone else who solves it just a little bit differently from you. And then finally, we have our product certification. So you are now able to take your core certification exam and prepare for it next week during our live training. We also have our advanced certification exam. And in case you would like to try your hand at the expert certification exam, you will need to register for that exam to take at Inspire. So if you have any questions on that, just go ahead and check out the product certification page at academy.alteryx.com. All right, so let's dive into the reason why we're here today, and that is building an analytic application, which we'll just call an app for today's session. And we're going to kind of situate today's training in a real-world foundation. So why might you actually want to go about converting a workflow you have into an analytic application? Well, why even build an app in the first place? If you have a workflow, what's the point of turning it into an app? Well, apps are a really great way to create an opportunity for another user, maybe an organization, a coworker of yours. So it gives these people an opportunity to interact with a workflow and customize their analyses without even having to touch a single Alteryx Designer tool. So it allows you for that customized analytic experience. It also allows you to deploy your workflow for mass consumption. And I'll show you a quick example of what I mean by that. If you haven't been to our Alteryx Analytics Gallery yet, it's kind of a neat place to explore some of these ideas about what an app might be. So I went ahead and found this app today that's just called Number of Sundays that someone named Gary Small created. And what I like is that, so Gary probably just built this workflow that he'd used for himself, that he runs over and over and over again, and decided, well, hey, other people might also need to do similar types of analyses. They may also want to compute the number of Sundays, so number of Sundays that occur within a certain date range. So let's say he wants to know the number of Sundays between January 1st, 2018 and today, May 1st. Well, he's given me the ability to use his workflow, but just asking me for certain parameters or customizable options that I want to use. So now that he's published this to the Analytics Gallery, and allows me to run it, now I don't have to build the same workflow that Gary did. I can just simply use his app to understand that 17 Sundays have already passed in 2018. So that's another reason why you might just want to build an app, is to take that work that you've already done and give hundreds or thousands of other people, whether that's internal to your organization or just to the general public, to consume it and use your work. And then finally, you might want to just share the joy of Alteryx with others who may or may not be able to use Designer, don't have quite the skill set yet to develop some of these workflows, or they might not even have access. But just sharing an app with them gives them the ability to go ahead and take advantage of some of these powerful analytics that you may be developing. So let's learn about the use case that we're going to be working on today. Is that many coworkers run a very similar report to output the top performing stores based on total sales. But the desired number of top stores varies by user. So you might have one user who's thinking, well, I want to know the top 10 performing stores within this sales region. Someone else is asking you to say, okay, I want a similar report, but I only want to see the top 5. And then someone else is asking you to run a workflow too that says, okay, I want to see all my top performing stores, but give me 20 of them. Well, instead of having to run or customize this workflow for potentially 3 different colleagues, or however many people might be asking you for this type of information, you can enable them to run and customize their own analyses by giving them an app. So let's do just that today. We're going to create an application that allows each of these different users to select an input file, a file that contains some of these stores and their revenue generation, so that way we understand who are our top performing stores. We're then going to give them the ability to choose a field on which they want to sort. So do they want to sort top performing based on revenue? Do they want to sort it based on customer traffic? Do they want to sort it based on another type of metric? We'll give them the opportunity to customize that. We'll also give them the ability to set the number of records to output, whether that's 10, 5, or 20 that they might want to see. And then finally, we'll let them choose the output location and a file type they want to write out to. So all of a sudden, we've taken our work and our input of having to run these potentially 3 different workflows for 3 different colleagues to just deploying and giving someone the ability to customize their own analytics using one single workflow. So some of these key concepts that we're going to cover today include converting an existing workflow into an app using some interface tools. And this tends to be a really popular type of conversion because typically you build a workflow first and realize that, hey, other people might want to use this same workflow, and then it goes into an app. It's pretty rare that you actually develop with an app in mind. So we'll kind of go through that mental process of what it looks like to go from workflow to analytic application. And then we'll also talk about some of these processes with configuring the interactive experience with the interface designer. So how do you give the ability for a user to interact with your workflow without even seeing what's going on behind the scenes? So we'll work on both fronts. We're going to cover some kind of a subset, I guess, of some of the interface tools that are available in Designer. We're going to be using a file browse tool to input and output data. We're going to be using a drop-down menu to allow people to decide the field on which they want to sort their data. We're going to use a numeric up-down to give people the ability to select how many different records they want to output, whether that's 5, 10, 20, 100, whatever it might be. And then in the middle between those two, we're also going to talk about the action tool and the error message tools. The action tool is a kind of a, we'll talk about it a little bit more, but think of it as a conduit for how a user sets an interface tool and how that selection impacts a tool in Designer. The action tool is kind of that relayer of information between the two. And an error message tool, which we'll talk about as well, is just the ability to say, hey, you didn't fill out a field I needed you to in this app. I'm going to stop you right here before you can go any further. So it's kind of a nice kind of catch for people who may not be interacting or using your app the way you intended it to be used. So let's go ahead and talk about some of these different tools and some of the nuances behind them. So the first file browse tool that we're going to use is essentially just that. It allows you to display a file browse. So selecting an input and then browse to where you'd like to save your file. It essentially acts like that dialog that pops up when you have an input tool or an output tool is tell me where the file is that you want to open, and tell me where you want to save this file at the end. And it goes both ways. You can allow it to input a file and use the same tool to also output a file. You can specify in this tool if you want users to be able to use or import fields or output fields, or I guess input fields mostly, using a wildcard or kind of an arbitrary file selection. You can allow that to happen here. It just kind of depends how you want to limit or how you want your user to be able to navigate through that experience. So that's the File Browse tool, pretty simple. The next one is our drop-down menu. This is probably one of the most common tools that you'll use, or one of the more common tools that you'll probably use when developing an app. And what it does is it allows you to display a list of values for a user to select from. So think of any time that you've clicked on, from the drop-down menu, and what does it give you? It gives you the ability to select one thing, and that is something to consider when you're going and developing an app, is how many selection options would you want a user to have, or how many things do you want a user to be able to choose in a particular option? If you only want them to be able to select one thing and only one thing, then the drop-down menu is a great way to do this, as it only just limits that user to select one option. And you can choose to display those values in a drop-down from a number of different ways. You can manually enter the fields that you want to have displayed. So if there's only two fields that you know you want displayed, whether that's, let's say, state and total revenue, I could manually type those in and only and always have those two displayed. I can select to have only my string fields displayed in this menu or only my numeric fields in this menu to kind of further limit the choices that my user might have to make. I could also select the fields or the fields to display based on whatever's coming in from a file. So those fields that I use, say, in an Excel sheet or a YXDB, it'll display all those fields that are available in that file. Or I can also feed it from an optional input. And we'll display that a little bit too as we build out our workflow. We'll take a look at each of these different options. But think that there's a number of different ways to feed that data of what appears and how to control or restrict what appears in this drop-down menu that you might be configuring. Then we have a numeric up-down field here, which, it appears my text box might be in the incorrect location. It's supposed to be around the box where it says select the number of records to sample, where you see 10, and you see those two different arrows. It goes up and it can also go down. And what this allows you to do is to select an increment to say, if I toggle up, if I press that up arrow, is it then going to show 15? And then 20, or is it going to go 11, 12, 13, 14? So it kind of allows you to navigate within a certain range of numbers, how many, quantitatively, how many things do I want to select? In this case, it's the number of records to sample. So how many do I want to see? Do I want to see my 5 top performing stores, my 10 top, or my 20 top performing stores? So this is where that numeric up-down will come in handy. And you can also configure certain numbers that are displayed or usable in this particular menu. So it allows you to set the range, so the minimum and the maximum. So if you only want users to be able to select, let's say 0 to 10, then you can select 0 to 10. Or what if you want 0 to 500? You can set those mins and maximums, or start at 100 and go up to 1,000, whatever you might want it to be. And you can also select the increment. So if you press up once, how many more, how much does that number in the box increase by? Does it increase by 100? So if you press up once, so does it go 100, 200, 300, or does it go up by 1? And you can also set the number of decimal places. So think about something like in the formula tool, for example, if you select a fixed decimal value, whenever you're setting the precision and the sample size, you can set like 19 and then 0.2, for example. That's an up-down numeric interface application. The next two that we're going to talk about are interface tools that are a little bit different, that you might not know you're interacting with, because they're not necessarily anything that the users or the end consumer will necessarily see. And the first one is this error message. The error message will cause an app or a macro, it's also usable for macros, to error based on a certain condition. The way that a user is going to understand that you didn't interact with the app the way I thought you were going to is by prompting an error message. So in this particular screenshot, you can see there were errors. You must select a field to sort on. What happened here is we implemented a rule to say that the option in the configuration window, select the field to sort on, must have a value. It must be populated. And if it's empty, then I want the user to stop processing right here, right now. They're not going to be able to go any further. And you can customize this error. So this one is particular to the fact that you must select a field to sort on. Or let's say that a user entered in my numeric up-down, let's say they entered a number that was out of range. Let's say my range is set from 0 to 100 and they put in 1,000. Well, I can put a condition in here to say error if a user enters a value that's greater than 100. And then this error message could say something along the lines of, if I wanted to be nice about it, is you must choose a number within 0 to 100, or if you wanted to be a little more forceful, you could just say, you know, wrong, nope, try again. So the error message tool will pop up kind of as a visual display, but that is something that you as an application designer have the ability to implement throughout your workflow at points where you feel it might be important to interact with your user as well. And then finally, the action tool. The action tool is probably one of the most important pieces of developing apps and macros, but apps really for today's session. And what this really does is, like I said before, that this is the relay of information. This is the conduit of telling an application or a workflow tool, so let's say a formula tool or a filter tool in a normal workflow, how to change based on what a user told you to do. So think about these different layers that we have. We have a workflow that's underlying just in Designer. We have then what the user sees are these windows to say, okay, I choose this file, I'm going to work with these numeric values, I'm going to, choose to view 10 of them. Well, how does the workflow know what to do with all these selections? You need something in the middle, and that something in the middle is this action tool. And it has many different configurations. We'll go through some of these as we build through our workflow, but you have the ability to say, based on what a user has selected, this is the part of a formula tool that I want to change, or this is the type of change I want to implement in my workflow. It's pretty powerful, and this is really what makes those apps so dynamic and useful for many different users. We should also talk about some of these tool anchors that you're going to see, which you can see here on the right as we work through our interface tool palette. The action tool actually has all three of these, which is why it's on this slide, but you're going to run into some of these across the interface tool palette. And that first one is that what we call the question anchor. It's black or can be white depending on if it's an input or output, with a Q in it, so question. And what it does is it accepts output connections from interface tool with the same icon. As we go through and build our app, we'll kind of talk about the importance of matching icon to icon. We also, you might run into an anchor that's mostly like a black diamond type of look. It's pretty rare. You don't see these too often. You'll see it on the action tool for sure. But that pretty much indicates that it only accepts an incoming connection from a conditional tool, which the condition tool is part of the interface tool palette. Not too commonly used, but it's important that it has its own anchor. And then finally, most commonly, you'll see that lightning bolt. Lightning bolt, and when you think of lightning bolt, think of, zap, action, change. When you have a lightning bolt, it means that something is going to change. So that's an important one to think about. All right, so we are ready to go ahead and open up our designer. Now that we are armed with our knowledge of some of these interface tools, we will go ahead and open up Designer. So I'm going to go ahead and pull over this workflow that I have. Actually, before I do that, let me just take a moment here to, I'm going to unshare my screen for just a brief moment to see if there's anything in the Q&A that I can address before we start building anything? Let's see. Can apps be used when inputting data from data sources other than files? Can they be used with NDB functionality? And that's a great question. So that, yes, absolutely. The thing that you have to be very careful about when allowing a user to input data is that they have to have access to that data, or they have to be able to somehow input, let's say, like a username or a password or some kind of credential to be able to access that data. But no, otherwise you're not limited at all as to how you possibly could ask users to input data, whether that's a database or a static file sitting on a desktop, or not even giving them the ability to input data, and you're just telling them what data to work with. And maybe that's always maybe the most recent version of an existing file on a network drive or something like that. But really the important aspect of that is access. Who can access it, and who are they running this app as? That's also very important. There was another aspect too that was asked about downloading data in an app, and yes, you can. You know, how you would want to do that, let's say, is putting in a text box and asking people to say which URL do you want to download from, and hope that that URL has the right format in terms of headers and things like that. And then that download tool in your workflow, for example, would be updated based on whatever's put into this text box or this text input tool. So there's a number of ways to do that, and that's what's kind of neat about apps is there's so many different ways to allow people to quote-unquote use Designer without using Designer. So let me go ahead and reshare my screen. Looks like those were the majority of the questions that were posed. So let me go ahead and share back, and we're going to go ahead and open up Alteryx Designer. Where did my Designer window go? Here it is. Alrighty. So you should be able to share or see my screen now. It's just a simple workflow that we've been using in Designer. And this is just a workflow that we've decided, you know, as a user, that we've been running for all of our other people who want to see a particular store with the total number of sales in descending order, so top performing and the top 10. So instead of having to go in and manually change each of these different configuration options in my sort tool and in my sample tool to run the first or pull the first 10 and then output my file, I want to give a user the ability to interact and kind of configure these tools themselves based on what they want to see. So we'll kind of go pretty slowly through this, but a simple workflow nonetheless. The real hard part here is not the workflow. One of the harder parts actually about developing an app is figuring out how you want people to be able to interact with this app. So what I like to do is before I even start building or before I even start thinking about adding interface tools onto the canvas is I like to outline each of my steps, or in my head, how I want a user to be able to interact with these. So in my head, I'm already thinking this little blue box is I want to ask them to input a file. So this is something I do want changeable, right? I want someone to be able to configure this input tool themselves. So I'm just going to mention that in a little box here. I want them to be able to input a file. I also want them to be able to sort on a selected field, and the way I want them to be able to choose this field in the sort tool configuration is based on a drop-down menu, because I only want to give them one option to use. So we're going to give them a list of metrics that they might be interested in, and we're going to let them choose this particular field, total sales. I also want them to be able to change in the sample tool this value here. I want them to be able to decide if they want 5 values, 10 values, 100 values, whatever it might be. And I want them to be able to choose that from a numeric up-down. You know, you also have some other options here. You could use maybe a text box. Probably not your best option, but could. But I think the numeric up-down for our purposes is probably the best option to either give people the ability to click up-down to toggle in between their values, or in the numeric up-down, you can also manually enter values. So it's a good dynamic user-friendly solution. And then I also want people to be able to output a file too. I want them to be able to say, this is what the file I want to write out, and this is where I want to save it. So now that I've decided how much of the workflow I want people to be able to control, now let's go ahead and start talking about, well, what makes an app an app? And really, all that makes an app is the file extension. So you can see here we're looking at a file that's called YXMD. All I would have to do to change this into an app is to go into my workflow tab in my workflow configuration and say, this workflow should actually be an analytic app. And once I do that, did you just see the little lightning bolts pop up here on my tools? Well, the lightning bolts, as you remember, are an indicator that this is changeable. This tool is now usable for someone to interact with in an app type situation. So that's pretty cool. All you'd have to do to make your first app is really just go ahead, click this button, and save it. And now this workflow, you can see I have this little nice wand here that just popped up next to my run button. This means I can run it as an analytic app. And if I save it, the file extension would be YXZP. So something else to look out for. So now that we're ready to go, let's go ahead and start building. I'm going to move these down a little bit so we can have a little more room for our interface tools to go. And let's start from the beginning. Let's go ahead and just say, let's work from the point at which I want people to be able to input or browse to an input file. So here's my interface tool palette. It's these black tools indicated here by the kind of up-down numeric values. And you can see I have a lot more tools in here than we're going to talk about today. But the ones we're hitting on today are kind of the heavy hitters and really the more popular ones. So let's go ahead and drop down our file browse tool. I'm just going to drop it kind of in line with my input tool. And as soon as I do, you can see that now I have this file browse configuration window. So this you're kind of working in two realms here when you're working with your interface tools. Yes, you're working on your workflow, but you're also working on an interface. So you're working on the messages, the text that will be displayed to a user. So when I drop down on the file browse is, what do I want people to do? Well, instead of this label for file browse, I want to prompt them to say, select an input file. That's the text that will be displayed, and I'm just typing that directly into the box. So now, here's your option for how you would select what types of fields that people could possibly, or what types of files people could possibly input. If you select the standard database file formats, it's the same window that's going to pop up as an input tool, standard input tool. So whether that's browsing to a database connection or a standard file or YXDB, whatever it might be. But this is typically the button you're going to want to click unless you want people to be able to browse to, let's say, an arbitrary file specification. So if you want to be able to give people the ability to use something like a wildcard. So for today, we just want them to be able to input a file. And so kind of the fun thing with the interface tools is you have a couple of different ways to update tools, so to connect, an input of an interface tool into a standard tool. So this is where also the tool anchors come into play. So you can see I have a question anchor that's coming out of my file input tool, and my input tool itself has a lightning bolt. Now when you're connecting or updating interface tools to standard tools, you have to match the anchors. But what's neat about this is, no, they don't match, but what I can do is I can go ahead and drag this down and connect it anyway, and it'll automatically throw in an action tool because it has recognized that, hey, your anchors don't match, but there's a way to get this queue to match this lightning bolt by matching a queue to a queue and then a lightning bolt to a lightning bolt by using an action tool. So that's kind of neat to know. All you have to do is just drag and it will automatically pop up with a way to say, hey, you need to connect these two in a way that makes sense. So let's go ahead and update this action tool. So how can we get this input to communicate with the standard input tool? Well, we're going to go ahead and click on the action tool configuration. Then if we click this drop-down menu for select an action type, we can tell it how to communicate. So how does this file input interface tool connect with my standard input tool? And you can see I have a couple different options. I can update the input data tool, which will essentially just update that whole configuration with the file selection. That's the default when connecting to an input tool, and that's usually the way you want to go. But I have seen some people that want to update a value with, let's say, part of the input tool. So let's say that they're only allowing people to connect to a certain file name, like if this was Alabama or Arizona or Rhode Island. You would only want people to be able to update a very specific part of an input file. Or you might want to have them update with a formula. Maybe that's adding today's date to connect to the most recent file. But for today, what we're going to do is we're just going to update the whole input data tool by default. So that's the action that we're going to select to connect this input to our input. And what's kind of neat is that if I click, let's see, like run as an analytic application, nothing will really happen, but we can kind of investigate what pops up is what's happening. Is as we're building, this is what your end consumer will see, is what's happening is that you can see these questions start to stack up. So select an input file. This is what we just configured. And this will allow me to go ahead and browse to any file I want. So we're not there yet, we're not quite done, but you can start to see how it develops. So let's move on to the next portion of our tool, which remember is that sort tool. We want to give people the ability to sort on a column from our input data using a drop-down menu. So I'm going to go ahead and drop on my drop-down menu tool. If I can find it, there it is. I'm going to go ahead and just connect that. Just drop it on my canvas right here. I'm not going to connect it to anything yet. So this is that drop-down tool that I'm going to ask people to choose a field for sorting. So in this configuration window for my drop-down, I'm going to go ahead and configure that right now. I'm going to go ahead and add in the prompt, select a field for sorting. And you can tell them to do that however you wish you want, however kindly or unkindly you might want. And this is where you have the decision to make about what values in particular are going to show up in this drop-down menu. We have a lot of ways we can do this. We can limit it to field types. So if you only wanted, say, string value types to go ahead or to be present in this particular drop-down, we can. We can connect these from an external source that we've manually formatted. You can choose that they're coming in from a connected tool. This is a very common configuration because wouldn't it make sense that you would only want to see the fields that are, coming from the upstream tool in your workflow? That makes sense. You can manually type these in yourself if you'd like using a specific format. You can also import these from a file. You can import these from any kind of third-party data sets you might have. But what we're going to do is we are going to actually connect it to our file browse tool that's present in this Analytic app. So we're going to select to allow this tool to read in the files or read in the fields that are coming from this particular file browse interface tool itself. So I'm going to go ahead and connect Q to Q. Q to Q. Dragged on in. So now I have select a field for sorting. And you can see once I do that, now I can also restrict the file or the field types that might be present in a data set. So if I only wanted my users to be able to select a numeric field, for example, then I would only want to select my integers and maybe my floats and doubles. So that way they wouldn't see anything called like state or store name, a field that's not available for sorting for them. I'll go ahead and just leave this here. We'll have our users view all of our fields that are coming in and just hope they do it right. Sometimes what's really helpful as well is this little box down here at the bottom is a default selection name and the partial is okay. So sometimes you might just want to prompt that there needs to be something in this box. And this is where I'm thinking, remember, we want to stop people in the app if they don't enter into this sort field. You know, think of the last time that you tried to do like online checkout or something like that and it turned you down because you forgot to fill out, like, I don't know, the state for your address, or, you know, the whatever code for a credit card, or whatever stopped you, you know, so you had to go back and redo it. And sometimes all it really takes for a good design is that you just have to give people, you know, an idea that something should be there. And in this case, this default selection name, a field called revenue, you know, might be enough of a prompt. Now, the pitfall of this is that people will see that it's populated and they might not change it. And so they might get results that they don't quite expect. So it's really kind of a design decision at this point to say, do I want to give people an idea of what to do or not? I'm going to say let's not, and just give them a blank drop-down menu that they can select or check their own fields from, because we're going to put in an error. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and configure the rest of this. So I'm going to go ahead and drop down. So my drop-down menu is going to update my sort tool. So again, I'm going to drag Q to the lightning bolt, and my action tool is again going to pop up automatically. So now I'm going to go ahead and configure this action tool. And what I want to do with this is this action is actually going to update a particular value. And the reason I think it's important to be very familiar with certain tool configurations is because, so this is the sort tools window, right? You select the field and you select the order in which it is sorted, whether that's descending or ascending order. The action tool presents that information or that configuration to you in a little bit different way. It's actually kind of, it trees it out. So now it's a tree. So this sort tool is sorting on a field called total sales. So that's the field value that you choose. And then the order is descending. So the value that we actually want to change in the sort tools configuration is represented by this, the total sales. So whatever we choose from this drop-down menu, whether that's total sales or total customer traffic or average customer transaction size, it's going to change this value in my sort tool configuration. So I'm just going to click it and select it, and that's all you need to identify which portion or which component of the sort tool needs to change. And you can see once I've clicked on it, it kind of gets highlighted in this gray background. So that way you know what's actually been selected here. And you can also see it grayed out here at the bottom in our total sales where it says replace a specific string. It's grayed out as kind of a placeholder there. So now that that part's done, let's think about this option that we chose, not to do, which is to give people a default selection. Instead, we want to stop them. So if they don't fill this out in our interface, we want to tell them, hey, you're going to get an error. And to do that, I'm going to go ahead and click on my error message tool. I'm going to drag that in, and I'm going to just kind of line it up somewhere here that's close to my general configuration of my sort tool. And you can see Q, incoming anchor, Q. So if this option, this configuration option is not selected, I want it to communicate with my error message tool. So I'm going to go ahead and connect Q to Q to create my connection and my communication line there. So what the error message tool does is it allows you to say if a condition is true, in this case, if a sort tool option or a sort configuration is not selected, I want to relay an error to my user. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to say, I'm going to give it an expression. I have to give it a condition to meet. So in this expression box, which you might recognize similar to what used to be the formula tool, I'm going to go ahead and create an expression. And I want to say my condition is that if connection number 1, this value that's coming in as connection number 1, if it's empty. That's my test. If it's true, if my expression is true, I want to relay a message to my user. I want to tell my user, you must select a field for sorting, or you can say, try again, whatever you want it to say. But this is what your user is going to read from you. So this is a neat way to kind of control or help a user navigate your app situation. You can see that the app does not have an output anchor. It doesn't connect to anything else. It doesn't necessarily update a tool. So it's kind of a standalone element of our interface designer, which we'll cover in just a moment. So let's work on our last two configuration options. Remember that we want the user to control this ability to select in the number of records that they want to output using a numeric drop-down, or a numeric up-down, excuse me. So I'm going to go ahead and drag on a numeric up-down tool, which is here. And again, just try to line it up. You know what, let me throw this up here so it's not in my way. Another neat trick that I've seen people really use is for particular tools is that sometimes you can make connections wireless. So if you find yourself getting caught up in some of these loops, you can right-click on any interface tool and make the connection wireless so that way you don't have some of these curly lines coming all over the place. That way you don't have to see it. It looks much cleaner. And if you do want to see what it's actually connecting to, the lines show up. But if you're just looking at the workflow, you know, you just see interface tools not necessarily connected to anything, which, you know, design preference, up to you. But sometimes it's a handy way just to keep things clean and neat. So anyway, let's go ahead and work back with our numeric up-down tool. So the numeric up-down tool, remember, is going to be able to say, okay, how many records do you want, whoever's running my app? So I am going to prompt a user here in the configuration window to select, whoops, caps lock, select number of records to sample. And this is where I have a lot of control as to how many they could possibly choose. I could say you can only choose from 100 to 500 records. Or you could say, you could select up to 0. You know, I'm going to say you have to go at least 1. Otherwise, you know, what's the point? But I'm going to limit you to a maximum of 100. And I could choose to limit that to however many I want, whether that's 500 or maybe that's 10, however many. And then I can choose how that number changes. If I press up in the drop-down, does it go up by 1? Or maybe does it go up by, I'm going to say 5. How many do you want as your default? That's another design choice that you could say, okay, most of my users tend to pick 10. That's also the default in the sample to itself, so it's not a bad choice. But this is where you can decide of how you want the user to potentially use your app correctly or not use it correctly. Do you want them to end up with 10 if they choose not to change this number? Or do you want to let them know, hey, you're only choosing 1 as your output, and if that's not what you want, you have to rerun this. This is where you'd be a little bit strategic, but I'm going to go ahead and just say 10 here. And since we're working with only whole numbers, I'm just going to say 0 decimal places since integers don't necessarily need those. And then again, how do I want this to communicate with my sample tool? Well, I'm going to drop this down and have an action tool come into the middle to have them communicate. And just as a refresher, remember our sample tool, we have the first n record selected and n equals 10, and we have no grouping. So when I go back to my action tool, how do I want it to communicate with my sample tool? Well, I want it again to update a value. And you can see now my number of choices, depending on my tool configurations, will change. You don't always have the same number of configurations each time. So I'm going to go ahead and just select the default, which is updating that value. And I'm going to, remember, change the component of the tool I want to change or update, which is 10, which is the number n. So you can see now that it's grayed out at the bottom here. This is the value that's going to change when a user interacts with my dropdown. And finally, to close this out, remember that I wanted to have people output a file when they're done. So I'm going to go ahead and drop in yet another file browse, because we can do this for inputs and outputs. And I'm going to go ahead and connect it to my output tool. This is the tool that this file browse will be updating. And I'm going to prompt the user to save an output file. And just like the input tool, I can give them the options to output, have that standard kind of output window come up, whether as a file, as a database, as a table, whatever it might be. They can output those the same way too. And they can output as an arbitrary file specification. You know, you probably won't use that for an output. You probably want them to just go ahead as a normal file or database connection or something. And then similar as we saw before is that we have the ability to just update the whole output data tool or update just the value of that tool configuration. We're going to go ahead and just update the whole output tool. So now we have all of our components together. Uh-oh, what don't you like? You don't like something. There we go. Missed a configuration option there. So now we have our whole interface put together. So let's go ahead and check this out just to kind of see what it looks like. So we can do this as run as an analytic app, or what we can do, which is probably the preferred method, especially from the developer side, is to go ahead and go to your interface designer. And I'm going to go to interface designer, which is under my view menu. It's usually not one of the windows that's popped up or docked on your screen. So you've got to go in and click that to open it up. And this is how you're going to configure the layout of the app and how it gets used and some of the customizable options that you may have. So on the interface designer, you have a couple of different menus here. This first one that you land is on the layout view. This is what your app looks like. So when your user clicks run this app, this is the menu and the dialog that they're going to be faced with. They're going to be asked to select an input file, select a field for sorting, select a number of records to sample, and save an output file. Now you have a number of different options here that you can do. You can add some things like group boxes or labels. You can even tab this out if you wanted to. So for example, if I wanted to tab this to call this my input tab, well, let's call this my selection tab. And if I wanted to move all of my selection options, let's say my field for sorting. So once I click this element, this configuration option, I have some arrows so I can move it up above my input file, down below. If I click side to side, I can move it from tab to tab. So now in my user will see on their first tab my questions and then what they need to select. So if I want to move all my selection options, for example, let's go ahead and move my number of records to sample over to another tab too. We can do that. We can also change the order in which they're layered. So let's say if we want to move our number of selected numbers there, I can move it up before I sort. So it doesn't really matter. I mean, the app interface is really where you decide how your user interacts. It doesn't have to necessarily be in the order in which your tools are laid out or the order in which you configure the app tools. So there's a lot of room for creativity here. I'm going to go ahead and highlight just a few more aspects of the interface designer before we go ahead and close out the session. As I see, we're getting close to the top of the hour. So I'm going to go ahead and just click on here. So this is your test view. Same wand that you see in your designer with this run as an analytic app. You have your test view. So you can see exactly what your app is going to look like when it's presented to a user. You also have the option to open debug mode. Debug mode is a little bit more advanced for, I use this for more of my advanced apps that I create, or when I know that there's a lot of tricky configuration options that I've done. And if you're interested, we can do another session on this for an advanced app section, but it's also something we're going to cover at Inspire in our advanced app section. And then finally, in our properties menu, this is another one that you'll probably want to use, is that you can either share a help file or a link that you may have, let's say you have a write-up to describe what an app does. You can provide a link to that just by simply clicking here and then hyperlinking that particular page. Chained apps is a term you may have heard, is that on success, we might want to run another app, or we might want another app window to pop up. You can link those two processes together, so that's kind of a neat component to do. Again, a little bit more advanced for app development, but something neat to know that is possible. Probably the more important thing, though, is to show, so on success, so once this app runs, what is the user going to see? Are they going to see any results from any output? If so, we need to check that. This can either be an output tool, it can be from a browse tool, it can be from any tool in the workflow that you could kind of relay those end results to. Or it's just going to be a window that says finish. They're not going to see anything until they open their file. You could do it either way. You could also provide an output message, so something that's, congratulations, your app ran, so yay. Or if there was no output file, if you want a user to know that, You could also say no output was created. So there's a number of different ways you can dialogue with your consumer as to, you know, what's going on behind the scenes they might necessarily be able to see. And then this is my favorite part, is for customizing your apps and macros that you can actually use a graphic. So if you have an app that you've created for something like, you know, that you have a currency converter or something like that, you might want to have different types of currency images there. Or, you know, if you just want it to be memorable and live on somebody's desktop, you can throw in a picture of, say, your cats, and that's the icon that will pop up on somebody's desktop. So use responsibly. But let's go ahead, and now that we've configured that in our interface designer, let's just take a look and see what happens. So let's run this as an Analytic app, and let's see what this looks like. So it looks like my cat fur didn't show up very well. But so here now we have the ability for our inputs to be selected here. So we can select a file, let's just say the store. Let's see what happens here, and I can save an output file, so I can write out a file to my desktop. I'm just going to save it as output. And then in my selections, I can select, let's say I want to know my top 10 performing stores and all the different fields that are available in that particular file. So the top 10 stores based on traffic. And then I can finish my app. It'll run. Here's my output message. Hooray, it's done. And I can open my files. If I click OK, it'll open up a file for me, which popped up right over here. So we've created our first app. Pretty easy, but also a very powerful solution for those who are looking to do some more dynamic problem solving. Let me go ahead and share my PowerPoint screen now for just to wrap up, and then we'll go ahead and get to some of those questions I know came in. But as a reminder, this was recorded. We're going to go ahead and share the workflows. We're going to share this recording in this session with you back on the community. And if you need any more help while you're still building some of these apps, please feel free to reach out to some of these resources for support. Of course, you have the community where you can post your questions, of course, search some discussion forums, read some helpful knowledge-based articles. There's plenty out there on app construction and interface tools. So there's lots of help ready for you. Of course, check out the Academy, where this live session will be posted here in another day or two for that workflow, so feel free. And there's a number, if you want to practice more, there's a number of weekly challenges that require app building. So some of those are good challenges and practice for you if you want to, you know, expand a little bit more in terms of today's skills. And then finally, if something's just not working, you can't figure out exactly what's going on, our fantastic support team is available to you at support@alteryx.com. Feel free to send them an email with any questions you may have. So on that note, we are done for today. I'll go ahead and check the Q&A, but otherwise, thank you so much for joining us for today's app session. Again, we'll be reposting this on community so you have the final workflow that we've built, as well as the recording, and maybe we'll see you next week for our session for preparing for the course certification exam. Thanks, everyone. So I saw a few questions that came in. So for those of you who are still on the phone, I'll go ahead and take a stab at some of those. Oh, there were a number of those. Okay, so let's see. Can you create a dynamic dropdown based on a field in the data? So I'm assuming that might mean forcing your drop-down menu to show only fields that are coming in from maybe an upstream tool or that are actually present in a file. And the answer to that is yes. That's one of the configuration options that are available to you in that drop-down tool. So another question came in. This is a great question, considering that apps are a great way to share your work. So what are some ways in which we can share our apps with others privately and or publicly? Well, publicly, you can definitely post your application to the Alteryx Analytics Gallery, which is what we showed early on in the presentation. So feel free, if you have an app you want to share, you can go ahead and post it there. You don't always have to have Alteryx on your machine to run an app. In fact, if you just gave somebody an app file and told it to, put this on your desktop and just click run, they'll be able to access that application and run it without necessarily having access to Designer. Now, also, if you have, let's say, it's a mix of public and private, but let's say you have a gallery for your organization, like you have access to Server, for example, and you want to post, let's say, an app that you've made to some of your colleagues, maybe in a collection or something like that. You can publish an app to the gallery there as well and allow people to share it, or allow people to use it and interact with it. And again, as long as they have access to the gallery, they might not have Designer on their desktop, for example, but as long as they can access the gallery, even as just a viewer, a viewer is someone who can just run an application. So that's an option too, for kind of that happy medium of sharing. There's a couple of different questions here that kind of go in the same vein, which is using the replace string option. So let me go ahead and reshare my screen, because I have a feeling that this might be a point that we want to see this. So for those of you who are still left on the call, let me go ahead and reshare. Share my screen, monitor 3. So let's take a look here. So the question let's see, pull up Designer again, is that in your action tool here, remember you had these action types, is that you could update a field list, or this is probably not the best one to show. Let me do this one. Or you could update a value with formula, but remember you have this replace a specific string component. So probably the easiest way to demonstrate this just real quick is, let me throw on a filter tool. Let me run this real quick so I can just refresh what I have in the data. So let's say I have then a filter that says city, it's Westminster, and total sales is greater than 40,000. So let's go ahead and configure that in our formula tool. So we have kind of a custom filter going on, and we want to know where, let's say, city equals Westminster. I hope I spelled that right. I think so. And let's say sales, total sales is greater than 40,000. So now we have a custom filter that contains two conditions. So let's say that we actually want, this drop-down menu to impact this filter. Let's go ahead and drop on a fresh one just so we don't mess anything up. Numeric. I'm going to go ahead and just connect this right in here. And I actually want this to connect to my lightning bolt because I want it to do something with this action tool. Nope, I got a little bit of a lag going. Oop, there it goes. So in this case, where I might want it to only impact part of this expression, this would be a really good option for only updating part of a string. So I would want to update a value, still by default, and the part of this filter tool's configuration I want to update is really this expression. But you can see, I have two conditions here, that city equals Westminster and total sales is equal to 40,000. Well, what do I want this numeric up-down to impact in that filter? I really only want it to replace this particular value right here, this 40,000. I don't want it to overwrite the rest of my filter conditions. I don't want it to overwrite Westminster and this condition that total sales has to be greater than X. I just want to change X. So in that case, the specific string I want to replace in this option is 40,000. So I would just leave 40,000 in the box to actually replace. And you can do that with a number of different things, whether that's a formula, whether that's anything that kind of has multi-conditions, or you only want a selection option from an interface tool to touch maybe one part of any of those expressions. So I hope that kind of gives a little bit more clarity on that. And you can do that with gosh, you can do that with so many different things. So I hope that gives a little bit more clarity around that particular configuration option. All right. Well, let's see. Let me double check that there aren't any more. Oh, there was a question about how to get the browse tool results to show up. Oh, we can do that real quick too. All you would have to do, let me go ahead and reshare my screen, and then we'll kind of close out with that, since that's a great place to kind of end some results. So let's say I'm going to go ahead and share my workflow again. Is that anytime I would just have a browse tool, so let's say I wanted to have a browse tool coming out of my workflow just at the end here. Let's see, all I'd need to do is add a browse. And let's say that instead of the output file results, I actually just want to show my user the results from this browse tool. All I would need to do at that, or to configure that option, is again go to my interface designer, and this browse tool should pop up here on the menu with the wrench. So that's kind of more of the, remember how it takes you to the layout view to begin with. But then if we go ahead to the wrench, this is where we actually have the properties, more the configuration of the app itself. Is that on success, I can show the results to a user. Now this box must be checked to show some results. And then from there, you can check which results you want to display. You can choose multiple here. You can choose them from a browse tool only. You can choose them from an output, and pretty much at any stage of the workflow. So if you want people to be able to see the outputs from multiple browsers along the workflow, you certainly could enable them to do that. But all you would need to do is just allow them to see results and then indicate which results you want them to see. All right, on that note, it is almost 10 past noon, at least here in Colorado, getting into lunchtime. I'm sure many of you probably feel the same way. So I'll go ahead and end today's session here. Again, thank you for joining. This session will be posted back on community, as well as the workflow that we built today will be shared with you all. And if you have any other questions, just please feel free to reach out on that thread, and we'll be happy to engage with you there. Hope you have a great Tuesday, everyone, and take care. See you next week.